How much land does a ghost need to wander? For Elias Thorne, the answer was 160 acres of dust and memory. The homestead sat like a bone bleached white under the Arizona sun, a monument to a life that had ended 5 years ago, though his own heart stubbornly kept beating. He worked the land not for profit, but for punishment, each furrow a line in a penance that never felt complete. The silence in the clapboard house was his constant companion, a presence so heavy it felt like a second shadow. Every evening, he set 2 plates at the small kitchen table, a ritual of remembrance for his wife, Martha, whose laughter was now just an echo in the rafters. One Tuesday, under a sky the color of faded turquoise, the routine broke. The winch on his well groaned with an unfamiliar strain. He'd been mending the fence line bordering the arroyo, the dry heat pressing on his shoulders, when the sound carried, thin and sharp. He left his tools and walked toward the sound, his hand resting near the Colt holstered on his hip, a relic from a time before he tried to trade violence for peace. Near the stone-ringed well lay a woman. She was Apache, her deerskin dress torn and stained with the earth, her face a mask of fevered exhaustion. Her hand was outstretched, fingers curled just shy of the bucket rope, a last, desperate reach for life. Her breathing was a shallow, rattling thing, a sound Elias knew too well. It was the sound of lungs filling with death. He froze. The local sentiment, stoked by land baron Silas Croft and his mouthpiece Sheriff Brody, was clear. An Apache was not a person but a problem, a savage to be driven out or put down. Helping her was an invitation for trouble to ride up his long, dusty driveway. It was a risk that could cost him the very land he used to punish himself. He could turn around, walk back to his fence, and let nature take its course. In a day, she would be gone. No one would ever know. But then he saw her lips, cracked and pale, whispering a silent plea for water. And in that desperate thirst, he saw Martha's last days. He saw her wasting away, her own pleas for relief a torment he could never answer. The grief that had hollowed him out now surged with a different kind of ache, a furious, protective instinct he thought had died with her. He knelt, his joints cracking in protest. "Easy now," he murmured, the words rough from disuse. He drew a bucket of cool, clear water. He soaped a corner of his neckerchief and gently pressed it to her lips. She sucked at the moisture with a pitiful urgency. Her eyes, dark and clouded with pain, fluttered open. They held no fear, only a profound weariness. For a moment, she seemed to see him, to register the act of kindness. Then her gaze unfocused, and a soft sigh escaped her. With a grunt, he lifted her. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a fragile collection of bones and spirit. He carried her into the house, past the empty chair at the table, and laid her on the cot in the spare room. He didn't have medicine, not the kind she needed, but he had water and shade. He had a quiet place for her to pass. He sat with her as the sun bled across the horizon, bathing the room in hues of orange and rose. He did for her what he could not do for Martha. He offered comfort in the final moments. He stayed until her rattling breast softened, then faded into the vast, waiting silence. She was gone. Elias felt no triumph, only a deep, settling quiet in his own soul. He had not saved her, but he had honored her. He covered her with a clean sheet, closed the door, and went to the porch to watch the stars emerge, cold and distant in the blackness. He would bury her at sunrise, on the little rise where he had buried his wife. It felt right. The next day dawned sharp and clear. The air was still cool when the rider appeared, a lone silhouette against the fiery sunrise. Elias saw him from the kitchen window, a figure moving with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle. He wasn't a townsman. The man rode straight and tall, his long hair bound by a simple leather strap, a rifle resting in the crook of his arm. He was Apache. Elias's hand went to his Colt, the old instinct flaring. He stepped onto the porch, letting the screen door slap shut behind him. The rider drew his horse to a halt 20 yards from the house. He didn't dismount. He simply sat, his eyes, dark and piercing, scanning the homestead. They were not the eyes of a raider looking for plunder. They were the eyes of a hunter, searching for a trail gone cold. For a long minute, neither man moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. The warrior's gaze swept over the well, the porch, and finally settled on Elias. There was no menace in it, but an intensity that stripped away all pretense. It was the look of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Elias broke the silence. His voice was steady. "You're looking for someone." It wasn't a question. The warrior's expression didn't change, but he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes darted to the house. "She is inside," Elias said, his words falling like stones into the quiet. "She came here yesterday. For water. She was too far gone." The warrior's jaw tightened, a subtle clenching of muscle that was the only sign of the blow he just received. He swung a leg over his horse, landing on the ground with a soft thud. He moved with a coiled, deliberate power, each step measured. He walked toward the porch, his eyes never leaving Elias. He was assessing him, reading the lines on his face, the posture of his body. He was looking for the truth. Elias met his gaze without flinching. He had done what was right, and he would not apologize for it, nor would he cower. He stepped aside and gestured toward the door. "Her name was Nalin," he said, recalling the name she had whispered in a moment of fevered delirium. The warrior stopped, his hard facade cracking for a fraction of a second. A tremor of grief passed through him. "Cale," he said, his voice a low rasp. It was his own name, offered not as a greeting, but as a statement of identity, a piece of himself laid bare in a moment of shared loss. Elias led him into the house, to the spare room. Cale knelt beside the cot, his broad shoulders slumping as he gently pulled back the sheet. He looked at his wife's face, now peaceful in death, and a sound tore from his throat, a low, guttural cry of such profound agony that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. It was the sound of a world ending. Elias retreated to the kitchen, giving the man his space. He poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of his lonely life. He was a farmer. Cale was a warrior. They were meant to be enemies, divided by a chasm of culture, language, and blood. But in that small, sun-drenched house, they were just 2 widowers, bound by a grief that knew no borders. Cale emerged an hour later. His face was a stoic mask once more, but his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. He needed to prepare her for her journey to the next world, he explained in broken, deliberate English. It would take time. He needed to build a morning fire. He needed to chant the old songs. "You can do it here," Elias said, meeting his gaze. "On the rise. By the 2 oaks." Cale stared at him, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. For a white man to offer his land for an Apache burial rite was unthinkable. It was an act of profound respect, or profound foolishness. "Why?" Cale asked, his voice low. Elias looked past him, out the window to the barren fields that held the ghost of his own love. "Because no one should have to mourn alone," he said. And in that moment, the 160 acres felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. The thin plume of smoke from Cale's morning fire was a signal. By late afternoon, 2 riders crested the hill. Elias recognized them instantly. Sheriff Brody, a man whose guts strained the buttons of his uniform, and Silas Croft, whose lean, predatory frame was always clad in tailored city clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the dust. Croft was the serpent in this hardscrabble Eden. He had bought up claims all over the county, squeezing out small homesteaders with legal threats and hired muscle. He preached progress and prosperity for the town of Redemption, but his vision was built on the bones of those who stood in his way, Apache and white man alike. He saw the remaining tribes not as people, but as pests infesting land that was rightfully his. They reined in near the porch, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Croft's eyes, cold and blue as ice chips, swept over the homestead and fixed on the smoke rising from the hill. "Thorn," Croft said, his voice smooth and condescending. "We had a report of activity on your land. Figured we'd check it out. Wouldn't want any trouble." "There's no trouble here, Silas," Elias said, his tone flat. He remained on the porch, his arms crossed. "No trouble?" Croft feigned surprise, gesturing with a gloved hand toward the smoke. "Looks a hell of a lot like an Indian signal fire to me. You harboring a savage, Thorn?" "I'm allowing a man to mourn his wife," Elias replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "She died on my land. He's burying her on my land. It's a private matter." Sheriff Brody shifted his weight in his saddle. "Private matter?" he wheezed. "There ain't nothing private about consorting with hostiles, Elias. There's a bounty on any Apache brave found this side of the reservation line. You know that. It's the law. The law," Elias repeated, a bitter taste in his mouth. "Your law, Croft. Written to serve your wallet." Croft's smile was thin and cruel. "It's the law of the land, Thorn. The law of progress. Something you seem to have forgotten, hiding out here with your ghosts. Now you will hand him over. We'll take him to Redemption, and the circuit judge can sort it out." Elias knew what that meant. Cale would never see a judge. He'd be shot, resisting arrest, before they were a mile from the farm. From the hill, Cale appeared. He had heard the voices. He stood beside the oaks, watching, a silent, imposing figure against the sky. He held no weapon, but his presence was a challenge in itself. "There he is," Brody said, his hand moving toward his pistol. "Leave it," Elias commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. He took a step forward. "This is my property. Cale is my guest. He is under my protection. You will leave." Croft laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Your protection? You're one man, Thorn. A broken-down farmer playing at principles. You think that means anything? I own this county. I own that tin star on Brody's chest. I can take your land, your well, everything you have. I can wipe you off the map." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Or you could be sensible. Hand over the Apache. I'll see to it you're rewarded." A gesture of civic duty. It was the choice laid bare. His barren, lonely life, or a principle he hadn't known he still possessed. He thought of Martha, of her unshakable belief in the quiet strength of decency. He thought of Nolan's last, grateful sip of water. He thought of Cale's raw, human grief. "Get off my land, Silas," Elias said, his voice resonating with a finality that left no room for negotiation. Croft's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "You've made your choice, Thorn. You've sided with them against your own kind. The town won't forget it." He wheeled his horse around. "Let's go, Brody. Let the traitor sit and stew in his righteousness. We'll be back." As they rode away, Elias felt a strange sense of liberation. The ghosts of his past were still there, but they were no longer his only company. He had made a stand, not just for Cale, but for the man he was supposed to be, the man Martha had loved. The cost, he knew, was yet to be paid. The siege began not with guns, but with whispers. Croft's poison spread through the town of Redemption like a fever. Elias Thorn, the quiet widower, was now a traitor, an Indian lover, who threatened the safety of them all. The general store owner suddenly found his ledgers didn't allow for any more credit to the Thorn farm. The blacksmith was too busy to shoe his horse. Faces that once offered a polite nod now turned away, eyes hard with suspicion and fear. Elias and Cale were marooned on their island of dust. Croft's men, a handful of hired thugs with rifles and cruel smirks, were a constant presence, camped just beyond the property line, a visible promise of violence. Inside the farmhouse, a strange and silent alliance formed. The two men, from worlds that were at war, found a common language and shared work and mutual respect. Cale, seeing the sad state of Elias's garden, showed him how to use crushed river stones to hold moisture in the soil, an ancient technique that brought a flicker of green life back to the withered plants. Elias, in turn, shared his food, his coffee, his silence. One evening, as they sat at the table, 3 plates now set, one for the living, one for the dead, one for a guest, Elias found himself speaking of Martha. He told Cale about her laugh, about the way she'd planted sunflowers along the fence line, determined to bring beauty to the harsh land. Cale listened, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. When Elias fell silent, he spoke of Nolan. He told of her skill with beadwork, how she could read the stories in the stars, how her spirit was as fierce and bright as a desert hawk. They were not sharing stories of their wives. They were introducing them to each other, bridging the divide between their worlds with the memories of the women they had loved. The grief was still there, a sharp and constant ache, but it was no longer a solitary burden. Their fragile peace was broken by a visitor who came under the cover of darkness. Dr. Hemlock, a man whose weary eyes had seen too much death and not enough kindness, appeared at the back door with a sack of flour and a bottle of whiskey. "The whole town's lost its mind, Elias," he said, setting the provisions on the table. "Croft has them spooked. He's telling everyone that this warrior of yours is the scout for a war party. There is no war party," Cale said, his voice quiet but firm. He had been cleaning his rifle by the hearth, a task he performed with meditative focus. "My people are scattered, dying. Croft knows this. He uses fear like a weapon. He wants your land, Elias," Hemlock continued, his gaze serious. "All of it. He's been trying to invalidate the original homestead charters, claiming they're void because of the Apache threat. He's using your guest as the perfect excuse to get the federal marshals involved. If he can prove the territory is hostile, the government will revoke the old claims and sell the land cheap, straight into his pocket." The full scope of Croft's cruelty became clear. It wasn't just about one man, one farm. It was about everything. "He gave me a choice," Elias said, his voice tight. "Give up Cale, and I can keep my farm. It's a liar's bargain," Cale stated, looking up from his rifle. "He would take me, and then he would take your land. A man like that does not honor his word. He only understands power." Dr. Hemlock nodded grimly. "He's called a town meeting for tomorrow. He's going to demand they form a posse to come out here and take Cale by force. To restore order, people are scared, Elias. They might just do it." When the doctor left, a heavy silence descended on the house. Elias walked to the window, staring out at the dark land that had been both his solace and his torment. He could still run. He could tell Cale to slip away in the night. He could save himself. But the thought felt like a betrayal. A betrayal of Nolan, of Cale, of Martha's memory, and of the man he was trying to be. "I will not run," Cale said from behind him, as if reading his thoughts. "I will finish the rites for my wife, and I will face what comes. But you, Thorn, you do not have to die for my honor." Elias turned. "This isn't about your honor, Cale. It's about mine." He looked at the empty place setting at the table, the ghost he had lived with for so long. "For 5 years I've been dead," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been a ghost on my own land. helping your wife, standing with you. This is the first time I've felt alive." He drew a deep breath. "They're coming for us tomorrow. We'll be ready." The morning arrived gray and grim, the sky bruised with the threat of a storm. Elias and Cale didn't barricade the windows or prepare for a shootout. Their strategy was different. It was a gamble on a flicker of conscience Elias hoped still existed in the hearts of his neighbors. They stood on the front porch, waiting. Cale was unarmed, his hands loose at his sides. Elias had holstered his Colt, but he had no intention of drawing it. Their defiance would not be one of violence, but of presence. Just after noon, they appeared. A ragged column of about 20 men, led by Croft on his fine black stallion and Sheriff Brody, looking sweaty and uncomfortable. They were farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, men Elias had known his whole life. They clutched rifles and shotguns, their faces a mixture of grim determination and nervous uncertainty. They looked less like a righteous posse and more like a herd being driven toward a cliff. The posse halted 50 yards from the house, a tense line of armed men facing 2 unarmed ones. "This is your last chance, Thorne," Croft shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "Send out the Apache, and no one gets hurt. Defy the will of this town, and we will burn you out." Elias didn't answer. He just stood there, a silent rebuke to Croft's blustering. The silence stretched, becoming more powerful than any threat. The men in the posse shifted on their feet, their eyes darting from Croft to Elias. They saw not a traitor, but a neighbor. A man they knew. Then, another sound. The slow, rhythmic clanging of a hammer on an anvil. From the road, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Gunnar, appeared. He carried his heavy forging hammer, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of his trade. He walked past the posse, ignoring Croft's sputtering outrage, and came to a stop at the bottom of Elias's porch steps. He turned, faced the crowd, and stood beside Elias and Cale. He said nothing. A few moments later, the general store owner, Mr. Abernathy, a man as thin and dry as a corn husk, walked up the path. He held a ledger. He, too, took his place, a silent sentinel. Then came 2 more farmers from the South Ridge, men whose water rights Croft had threatened a year prior. They joined the line. They were not there to fight. They were there to stand, to bear witness. Dr. Hemlock had done his work in the night, not with calls to arms, but with quiet conversations about decency, about Croft's boundless greed, reminding them that the fire Croft wanted to set today at Elias's farm could easily reach their own homes tomorrow. Croft's face contorted with rage. His power was built on isolating his victims, on turning neighbor against neighbor. He could not comprehend this silent solidarity. It was a force his money could not buy and his threats could not break. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared at Gunnar. "Are you with him? With a savage against your own town?" Gunnar looked at Croft, his gaze level. "I'm with Elias," he said, his voice a low rumble. "And this ain't about towns or savages, Silas. It's about a man's right to bury his dead in peace." Something you wouldn't understand. The line of men stood firm. The posse wavered. Their certainty was gone, replaced by a shamefaced doubt. They were not Croft's army. They were neighbors who had been led astray by fear. "Brody, arrest them all!" Croft shrieked, his composure shattering. "Arrest them for insurrection." Sheriff Brody looked at the line of determined faces. He looked at Elias. He looked at his own men, who were already lowering their rifles. He was a corrupt man, but he was not a stupid one. He knew a losing fight when he saw one. He slowly, deliberately shook his head. "It's over, Silas," Brody said, his voice flat. "Go home." Defeated, his authority evaporated into the dusty air. Silas Croft stared at the small group of defiant men. He had lost. He yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply it reared, and galloped away, a lone figure of impotent fury. The posse dissolved, the men melting back toward town, their heads hung low, leaving their fear behind them on Elias Thorne's land. Cale finished the last of the rites as the storm finally broke, the rain washing the dust from the air and darkening the soil of the grave on the hill. When he came down to the house, his duty was done. Nolan was at peace. He and Elias stood on the porch, watching the rain. The world felt clean, new. "The men who stood with you," Cale said. "They have honored you. They honored themselves," Elias corrected quietly. Cale reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden hawk, its wings outstretched. "For your son," he said, though Elias had never mentioned a child. But Cale, in his wisdom, had seen the third, invisible ghost in the house. The empty space left by a child lost with his mother. Elias took the carving, his fingers trembling slightly. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged that part of his grief. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a debt of gratitude passing between them that words could never capture. The next morning, Cale left. He rode east, toward the rising sun, a lone man seeking a new path in a world that had tried to erase him. Elias watched the dust trail from his horse fade into the horizon. He turned and went back inside. The house was still quiet, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of loss. It was peaceful. On the kitchen table, Gunnar and Dr. Hemlock sat nursing cups of coffee. They had come to check on him, and had stayed. The smell of frying bacon filled the air. Elias looked from the faces of his new friends to the small wooden hawk on the mantelpiece. The ghosts were still there, but they were no longer his jailers. They were part of a larger story now, one of defiance, kinship, and redemption. He was no longer just a widower on a patch of haunted land. He was Elias Thorne. And his home was, once again, full of life. He watched the last of the morning mist burn off the fields, then turned back to the house, where for the first time in 5 long years, a second lamp had been lit against the coming dark.